Whispers in the well. The well had always been there, but no one ever talked about it. The villagers in the quiet countryside passed it by like it didn't exist, even though it stood tall among the gnarled trees in the woods, its stones slick with moss and age. Clara, 12 and braver than she should have been, was the kind of girl who looked at such things and felt the pull of mystery. Her parents called it curiosity, but Clara called it boredom. She spent her days roaming the fields and the woods, the safe parts anyway. That's how she found the well. It started with a whisper. A faint sound, like the wind slipping through a crack in a door. She thought she imagined it at first. But as she got closer, she realized the sound wasn't random. It was saying her name. Clara. Her heart jumped, but not with fear, at least, not yet. She leaned over the edge, her breath puffing against the damp, earthy smell rising from the darkness below. The stone rim was cold under her fingers, and she swore she heard something else now, laughter, soft and distant. That night, the whispers came back, but this time, they followed her home. She heard them while brushing her teeth, faint and teasing, like water trickling from a leaky faucet. She turned the tap off and listened. Clara, come back. Her parents didn't believe her, of course. They said it was her imagination, or maybe the wind. But when she went back to the well the next day, the whispers got louder, and she saw it, her reflection in the water. It wasn't her. Not really. The girl staring back looked like Clara, but wasn't. Her eyes were too bright, her grin too wide, her face too hungry. Trade places, the reflection whispered, her voice echoing like a broken record. You belong here. Let me be you. Clara stepped back, her heart pounding. She ran all the way home, but the whispers followed, growing sharper, more insistent. That night, she dreamed of falling into the well, its cold water closing over her head, her reflection pulling her under. The next day, she begged her parents to leave, to take her far away. They laughed it off, thinking it was just a child's fantasy. But the whispers wouldn't stop. They started to scream, shrill and relentless, filling every corner of her mind. And then, one night, Clara disappeared. Her parents woke to find her bed empty, the sheets cold. They called her name until their voices broke, but all that answered was the faint echo of a whisper, rising from the woods. Clara. The well still stands there, hidden among the trees, silent for now. But the villagers know better than to go near it, and sometimes, when the wind blows just right, they hear her name. Clara. Forever etched into the night. The Forgotten Tracks. The town of Glenwood wasn't much more than a collection of sagging houses and overgrown lawns. Beyond the outskirts, where the pavement gave way to gravel, lay the forest. The locals called it Whispering Pines, though no one seemed to know why. Maybe it was the way the wind slipped through the tall trees, carrying faint murmurs that prickled the skin. Maybe it was something else. Jeremy, Cassie, Luke, and Mallory had lived in Glenwood their whole lives. Like most teenagers, they spent their days looking for something, anything, to break the monotony. On a cloudy afternoon, boredom led them to the woods. Mallory claimed she'd heard about an old railway hidden somewhere deep in the pines. The others laughed, but when she dared them to find it, they couldn't resist. It's probably just a rusty old track, Luke said, kicking at the dirt path as they walked. Then why hasn't anyone found it before? Mallory shot back. It's supposed to be cursed. Cursed? Cassie rolled her eyes. Oh, please. But when they found the tracks, twisted and overgrown, hidden under a blanket of moss and leaves, no one laughed. The air seemed heavier here, the sky darker. The trees loomed like silent watchers. See? Mallory said, grinning. Told you it was real. Jeremy knelt down, brushing away the debris. Looks like it hasn't been used in forever. Maybe we should go back, Cassie muttered, glancing around nervously. This place gives me the creeps. Chicken, Luke teased, but his voice lacked conviction. They followed the tracks deeper into the forest, the light fading as if the trees were swallowing the sun. After an hour, they came to a clearing where the tracks disappeared into a crumbling tunnel. Above the entrance, a rusted sign read, "Midnight Line." "Midnight Line?" Jeremy read aloud. "What does that mean?" "It means we're leaving," Cassie said firmly. "Now." But before they could turn back, a low, mournful whistle echoed through the trees. The sound wasn't distant. It was close, too close. The air vibrated, and the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. Then, emerging from the tunnel, came the train. It wasn't like any train they'd ever seen. The engine was massive, blackened with soot and rust, its windows glowing with a ghostly light. Steam billowed from its sides, though it made no sound other than the whistle. It slowed to a stop in front of them, and the door to one of the cars creaked open. "No way," Luke whispered. That can't be real." "It's real," Mallory said, her voice trembling. "I told you." The conductor stepped out. He was tall and gaunt, his uniform faded and threadbare. His eyes were hollow sockets, and when he smiled, his teeth were yellowed and jagged. "Tickets, please," he rasped, holding out a skeletal hand. None of them moved. The conductor's grin widened. "No tickets? No matter. There's always room for more." The teens turned and ran, the conductor's laughter chasing them through the forest. But no matter how far or fast they ran, the train's whistle echoed behind them, growing louder and louder. When they finally reached the edge of the woods, the sound stopped. They looked back, but the tracks were gone. There was no sign of the train or the tunnel. What just happened? Jeremy panted, his hands on his knees. "It found us," Mallory said. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. "The stories, they're true. The midnight train takes people. Once it knows you, it doesn't stop." "So what do we do?" Luke asked. Mallory swallowed hard. "We find out what it wants." Over the next few days, they scoured the town's archives and spoke to anyone who'd talk about the train. They pieced together the story. Decades ago, the midnight train had been real. It ran one last journey on a stormy night, carrying passengers who were never seen again. The conductor, it was said, had made a deal with something dark, a pact that cursed the train and all who boarded it. Now, the train returned every few years, searching for new souls to join its eternal journey. "If we can find out how to break the curse," Mallory said, "maybe it'll leave us alone." But the train wasn't willing to wait. That night, they heard its whistle again, distant but unmistakable. The teens knew it was only a matter of time before it came for them. Armed with flashlights and resolve, they returned to the woods, determined to end it. The train was waiting for them at the clearing, its ghostly lights cutting through the darkness. The conductor stood by the open door, his hollow gaze fixed on them. "You can't fight it," he said. "The tracks go on forever." But Mallory stepped forward, holding out a locket she'd found in the archives. "This belonged to you," she said. "Before the curse." The conductor's grin faltered. His skeletal hand reached for the locket, trembling. As he took it, the train shuddered, its lights flickering. The air filled with a deafening roar, and then, silence. When the teens opened their eyes, the train was gone. The tracks were overgrown once more, as if they'd been undisturbed for decades. "Is it over?" Cassie whispered. Mallory nodded, though she didn't look convinced. "For now." But deep in the forest, the faint sound of a whistle echoed, a promise that the midnight train would one day return. The midnight patient. Emma adjusted her scrubs and glanced at the clock on the wall. Midnight. The hospital was quieter now, its usual bustle subdued into hushed murmurs and the occasional beep of machines. This was her second week working the night shift, and though she was getting used to the eerie stillness, something about this place felt off. Room 13, especially. It was at the end of the corridor, tucked away like an afterthought. The other nurses avoided it, their gazes darting away whenever they walked past. Emma had noticed it on her first night. The plaque on the door was faded, the number barely legible. Inside, the room was dimly lit, but she had seen him, a man sitting upright in the bed, his frame gaunt and his eyes hollow. She hadn't thought much of it at first. Patients came in all shapes and states. But something about him lingered in her mind, a gnawing unease she couldn't shake. Tonight, as she passed the room, she paused. The man was there again, his bony hands resting on the blanket, his head tilted slightly as if listening. Emma hesitated before stepping closer. "Can I get you anything?" she asked softly, her voice cutting through the hum of the fluorescent lights. The man didn't respond. He only watched her, his eyes dark and unblinking. She felt a chill creep up her spine. "Emma." The voice startled her. She turned to see one of the senior nurses, Karen, standing a few feet away. "What are you doing?" "I was checking on the patient in room 13, Emma said, gesturing to the door. Karen's face went pale. "Room 13, she repeated, her voice dropping to a whisper. "There's no one in there." Emma frowned. I've seen him. Every night. He's always sitting in the bed." Karen's expression darkened, and she pulled Emma aside. "Listen to me. That room's been sealed for decades. There was a fire years ago, patients died, staff too. We don't use it anymore." Emma blinked, the words not fully registering. "But I saw him," she insisted. Karen shook her head. "Just stay away from it. Trust me." That night, Emma couldn't stop thinking about room 13. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the man's hollow eyes burned into her memory. Karen's words swirled in her mind, but they didn't add up. How could the room be empty when she had seen him so clearly? The next night, she resolved to find out more. During her break, she approached the records office. The clerk was reluctant at first, but after some coaxing, she handed Emma a file labeled Incident, Room 13. The fire had happened 30 years ago. A patient, a man named Leonard Crane, had been admitted for severe burns. He had become obsessed with the idea of paying off some unknown debt, muttering about sins and flames. The fire that consumed room 13 had started in his bed, though no source was ever found. Leonard's body was never recovered. Emma's hands shook as she closed the file. That night, she returned to room 13. This time, she opened the door. The air inside was heavy, the smell of smoke faint but unmistakable. The man was there, just as she had seen him before. He turned his head slowly, his lips moving. "Help me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Emma stepped closer. "Help you how?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The debt," he rasped. "Unpaid. It burns." She wanted to turn and run, but something held her there. His eyes locked onto hers, and she felt a pull, like invisible hands drawing her closer. Images flooded her mind, a house consumed by flames, a woman screaming, Leonard standing in the midst of it all, his hands covered in blood. "What did you do?" Emma whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Atonement," he said. "Please, free me." Emma's heart raced. She didn't know how to help him, but she couldn't leave him like this. She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched his. The moment their skin connected, pain shot through her, searing and blinding. When she came to, she was on the floor outside room 13. The door was shut, the hallway empty. Her colleagues found her moments later, shaken but unharmed. The next day, she learned the room had been sealed again, this time permanently. No one spoke of it, and the staff avoided the corridor altogether. But Emma knew Leonard's spirit still lingered, bound to his guilt and the flames of his past. And sometimes, late at night, when the hospital was at its quietest, she swore she could hear his voice calling her name. The Shadow Collector. The air in Lila's darkroom was thick with the sharp smell of chemicals, a tang that clung to her skin and clothes long after she left. She loved this space, a sanctuary where light and time came together to create something tangible. Tonight, however, the air felt heavier, as if something unseen pressed against the walls, watching her. She hung the last of her photographs to dry, stepping back to admire them. Her latest project had been simple enough: abandoned buildings around the city, their decayed beauty framed by her camera. But as she looked closer, her stomach tightened. In each image, there was something she hadn't noticed before: shadows that didn't belong. They twisted and stretched unnaturally, clawing at the edges of the frames as though desperate to escape. Lila rubbed her eyes. "I must be tired," she muttered, but the unease lingered. Her camera sat on the counter, an old, battered thing she'd picked up at a flea market weeks ago. The vendor, a gaunt man with a sly smile, had said little beyond, "It's yours if you want it. Free of charge." She'd taken it, intrigued by its weight and the faint engraving on its side: "To capture is to claim." At the time, the words had seemed poetic, almost romantic. Now, they felt like a warning. The shadows started appearing elsewhere. First in her apartment, a flicker in the corner of her eye, a dark shape that vanished when she turned her head. Then outside, in reflections and puddles, where she'd catch glimpses of movement that shouldn't have been there. Her unease turned to fear when she developed her next roll of film. This time, the shadows were unmistakable, figures with hollow faces and grasping hands, their eyes fixed on her. She recoiled, the photo slipping from her fingers. "What the hell is going on?" she whispered. She turned to the camera, now sitting innocently on the shelf. Picking it up, she examined the inscription again. "To capture is to claim." Lila's hands trembled. She spent the next day researching everything she could about old cameras, soul legends, anything that might explain what she was seeing. Most of it was folklore, stories of cursed objects and mirrors that trapped spirits. But one account stood out, a camera rumored to capture not just images, but the essence of what it photographed. The article called it the Shadow Collector. It can't be real, she told herself, but the weight in her chest said otherwise. The shadows grew bolder. They no longer stayed in the photographs. They seeped into her apartment, curling under door frames and pooling in corners. She'd wake at night to find them stretching across her ceiling, whispering in voices too faint to understand. She tried destroying the photos, but the shadows remained, their presence a reminder of what she'd done. Desperation drove her back to the flea market. She searched for the vendor, but his stall was gone. The other merchants claimed no one like him had been there in years. Her last hope was the inscription. She spent hours deciphering its meaning, poring over old texts and forums. Finally, she found a clue. The camera didn't just trap souls. It demanded a trade. Each photo claimed a piece of its subject, but to break the curse, it required the photographer's own shadow to complete its collection. Lila stared at the camera, dread pooling in her stomach. "You want me," she said aloud. The shadows around her seemed to stir, their movements almost eager. The room grew colder, the air pressing against her like invisible hands. She picked up the camera, its weight heavier than she remembered. "Fine," she said, her voice shaking. "But I'm not going quietly." Lila's plan was reckless. She set up her darkroom one last time, placing herself in front of the camera. The timer ticked down, the room silent except for the click of the shutter. As the flash went off, the shadows surged toward her, their forms twisting into something almost human. For a moment, she thought she'd failed. Then, the room erupted with light. The shadows recoiled, drawn into the camera's lens as though by a magnetic force. Lila screamed as her own shadow began to stretch, pulling away from her body, her very essence unraveling. The camera clicked again. Then silence. When the other photographers found her, the darkroom was empty, save for the camera sitting neatly on the counter. The photographs hanging on the walls were gone, replaced by blank frames. No one knew what had happened to Lila, and her name soon faded from memory. But the camera remained, waiting for its next owner. The inscription gleamed faintly in the dim light: "To capture is to claim." The ghost train. The old station sat in the middle of nowhere, a forgotten piece of history. Its cracked platform was overgrown with weeds, and the rusted rails had been unused for years. The station had a haunted feel, as though it were waiting for something to come back, waiting for a time long past. It was just after midnight when the silence was shattered. A high-pitched whistle, shrill and eerie, echoed through the dark. The air grew colder. At first, they thought it was a trick of the wind, but then, from the darkness of the far tracks, a light appeared. A train. It wasn't like any train they'd ever seen. Sleek, black as coal, its surface gleamed under the pale moonlight, as if it had just been polished. It rolled into the station with a soundless grace, the wheels gliding over the ancient tracks as though they hadn't been forgotten for years. There were 4 of them, teenagers, daring and reckless, with nothing but the thrill of the moment in their eyes. Greg, Emily, Sam, and Lily. They had been bored, looking for something to do. This, they decided, was the perfect dare. "Let's get on," Greg said, grinning. "Are you crazy?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. But the others had already begun climbing aboard. It wasn't a train they could have imagined, even in their wildest dreams. The doors swung open of their own accord, as if the train had been expecting them. Once inside, the air was stifling. The seats, upholstered in red velvet, looked immaculate, but something felt wrong. The entire train car was unnervingly silent, save for the soft creak of the train's motion and the low hum that seemed to vibrate the very bones of the building. Then, the doors slammed shut. Greg looked out the window, but the station was already gone, replaced by nothingness. Only blackness stretched beyond the glass. The train was moving faster than it should have been, its speed a surreal blur. The air grew even colder, and a feeling of dread crept in. Lily was the first to scream. The car had changed. It had started out normal, maybe too normal, but now it was twisting, warping, as though the walls were closing in. The windows distorted the world outside, flickering like an old television screen. Then came the first nightmare. The car became a dark forest, shadows shifting between the trees. There was someone, watching them, moving silently among the thick, oppressive woods. Each of them felt it, the presence growing closer, pulling them into the depths of the forest. Emily began to sob, clutching Greg's arm. "What is this?" she whispered. But before anyone could respond, the train lurched, and the world around them shifted again. This time, the car was filled with water, icy, suffocating water that swirled around their ankles, rising higher by the second. Greg tried to push open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Sam tried to grab hold of the rail, but his hand slipped, the water freezing his fingers like ice. "Help!" Sam screamed. But there was no one to help them. The nightmare continued, each car revealing a new horror. The next one was a carnival, twisted, with grotesque clowns laughing in the shadows. The one after that was a sterile white room, empty except for a chair in the middle, and a man sitting in it, his eyes hollow, his face a grotesque mask of anguish. The train sped on, faster and faster. Time and space no longer made sense. They were trapped in an endless loop of terror, each moment blending into the next, with no way to escape. Then, it became clear. The train had no end. It had no destination. The wheels turned, the whistle blew, and the darkness stretched out in all directions. This wasn't a train that went anywhere, it was a purgatory. And they had no choice but to ride it. They weren't getting off. The ticket they'd taken that night had only one way to go. The curse of the silent village. Mia had been lost for hours. The dense forest around her seemed to stretch on forever, its towering trees blocking out the sun and leaving only dim, filtered light. The air was thick and still, the only sounds the crunch of leaves beneath her boots and the occasional rustling in the bushes. She hadn't seen a road or any sign of human life for miles. It was as if the world had narrowed to just her and the trees, an endless, oppressive wilderness. She stumbled upon the village by accident. The path had been so overgrown she hadn't even realized she was walking toward something until the clearing opened up before her. At first, she thought it was a dream. The village looked so strange, so out of place, as though it didn't belong in the real world. The houses were old, built from dark wood and stone, their rooftops sagging with age. But what struck her most was the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of an empty place, but something deeper, heavier. The air was suffocating, and there wasn't a single sound, no birds, no wind, not even the hum of insects. It was as if the village had been cut off from the world, locked in a state of unnatural stillness. Mia stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't explain why, but she felt an overwhelming need to keep moving, as if something was pulling her in. As she walked through the village, she saw the people. They were standing in their doorways, watching her with wide, unblinking eyes. Their faces were obscured by shadows, their features hidden in the dim light. They didn't speak. They didn't move. They only stared. Mia felt her breath catch in her throat, a strange unease settling over her. She wanted to run, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. Her eyes darted around the village, searching for any sign of life beyond the still figures. But there was nothing. Just that suffocating silence. Then, as if on cue, one of the villagers moved. Slowly, almost painfully so. The figure stepped forward, its arms stretched out in an urgent, pleading gesture. But there was no sound. Nothing to break the silence that hung in the air like a weight. Mia opened her mouth to speak, to ask if they needed help, but the words tumbled out before she could stop them. "Hello?" The words shattered the stillness like glass, a sharp crack that seemed to echo into infinity. The effect was immediate. All at once, the villagers froze. Their heads snapped toward her, every single one of them turning in unison. Their eyes grew black, wide, and empty, locked onto her with a piercing intensity. It was as if they had been waiting for that very moment, waiting for her to make a sound. She could feel their gaze on her like a physical force, and for a moment, she wondered if they could hear her heartbeat pounding in her chest. The ground beneath her feet rumbled, and then she heard it. A low, guttural roar, like a beast waking from a long sleep. The sound seemed to come from deep within the forest, rising in volume until it reverberated through the very air. It was a sound that didn't belong in the world, a primal, unearthly noise that made her skin crawl. The villagers' eyes widened in terror. They backed away, their bodies melting into the shadows like smoke. They faded into the darkness, their forms dissolving into nothingness as if they had never been there at all. And then Mia understood. The village was cursed. The silence wasn't a blessing, it was a trap. The villagers weren't afraid of her, they were afraid of what she had summoned with her words. A creature, ancient and hungry, that fed on sound. Mia turned, her pulse racing, but there was no escape. The forest had closed in around her. She could hear it now, the sound of something moving, something monstrous. It was close. Very close. Every breath she took, every movement she made, would draw it nearer. She was its prey now, her very presence a lure for the creature that stalked the silence. She could hear the rumbling grow louder, the air thick with tension as something huge shifted in the darkness, drawn to her like a magnet. Her heart hammered in her chest, and she knew with a sickening certainty that there was no way out. The creature would come for her. It would find her. And there would be no sound to warn her.